This is the Middle-earth philosopher. Would Smaug and Durin's Bane have teamed up with Sauron in the Third Age to form an axis of evil? This is one of those questions that has been popping up more often within the last few years since the Hobbit trilogy came out. Though it's only an adaptation of the book, Smaug does make a passing reference to Sauron, indicating that, in the adaptation at least, he is at least somewhat aware of him, but has also made no attempt to contact him, his emissaries, or made any offers to joining forces with him, nor does Sauron seem to do the same. The Balrog of Moria also makes no reference to Sauron at all, but instead is known to have, and implied by Gandalf as well, to have served the same master as Sauron back in the First Age, Morgoth. And think about it. If Sauron really did want to bring back the nightmare that was the final centuries of the First Age, a Balrog and a dragon definitely fits that bill, along with his armies. So, in universe, would such an axis of evil have worked? Could they cooperate and conquer all of Middle-earth? This question is more nuanced than it sounds, and needs to be answered in turns. So, first let's start with Smaug. Acknowledged as being the greatest threat to the north of Middle-earth since the Angmar Wars, Gandalf and the appendices of the Return of the King implies the hell that he would have wrought during the final wars of Middle-earth had Smaug not been killed. And the adaptation, at least, also implies that Gandalf agreeing to accompany Thorin and his company had more to do with Smaug than it did with helping the Dwarf Lord regain his inheritance. The trilogy also implies that Gandalf is equally worried about the return of Sauron, and therefore an alliance between the two. Going with both interpretations of this does warrant his concern, I think. Because, again, a Maiar and the dragons have worked together in the past for evil purposes. It's assumed Sauron fought somehow, at least, during the War of Wrath, and it was the dragons, during the War of Wrath, that nearly turned the tide of that war back in Morgoth's favor before Ancalagham the Black, the single greatest dragon of all time, was somehow killed by Arendil. And remember, this was against the greatest army Middle-earth had ever seen. How much more dire would it have been against the armies of Middle-earth as they stood at that time in the Third Age, divided and with no divine backup really allowed, at least not at the level as their First Age ancestors were during that war. There is an argument against this though, as Thranduil claims in The Hobbit Battle of Five Armies that Gandalf is exaggerating the seriousness of the situation more than necessary. Consider, in both versions, Smaug doesn't care about such grand ambitions as conquering the world. Yes, he's sadistic, evil, cruel, and mostly greedy, but his sights are also much more immediate and practical than such grandiose plans that Morgoth and Sauron would have had. It has also been said that Smaug is a young dragon and been born in the Third Age somehow, and therefore was not even alive during the War of Wrath either. So then, that eliminates any veteran's claim to have served under the same leader that Sauron could use to gain Smaug's allegiance. Most of all, Smaug is just as intelligent, evil, and perhaps less cunning than Sauron, but more cunning than most in Middle-earth. Sauron either negotiated his ways to make allies or intimidated others into his service. Smaug's ego won't allow himself to be intimidated. Fuck Sauron's gaze. Perhaps a Vala could pull it off, but not a Maiar, not even one as powerful as Sauron. And he sure as hell wasn't going to leave his stolen treasure alone so he can go off to war and then have the dwarves sneak back into the Lonely Mountain during his absence and take it back. I like how the movies directly mention this possibility as one of the reasons for Thorin even making the attempt in the first place, because Smaug has been rumored to have not been seen in years, and it's a possibility that he may have just up and left or somehow even died. So, theoretically, the dwarves of Thorin's company should have been able to just walk right in. And it's been argued that Sauron may be better just leaving the dragon alone as well. As extremely useful as dragonfire would be to him, having a deterrent to his enemies rallying together in the north and then coming down south, which has happened before in the past, could also be useful. So therefore I think that's a no for Smaug the Golden joining Sauron or any alliance even forming between the two. However, what about Durin's Bane? Most of the points I've made for Smaug not joining Sauron don't apply here. Both served under Morgoth and fought during the War of Wrath. Both are Maiar spirits, being older than time itself. Both had chosen to flee from the calls of the Valar to surrender and return to Valinor for judgment. Sauron and Durin's Bane have much more in common than Smaug. Also, Balrogs are terrifying, but they weren't noted for their intelligence or cunning. Balrogs were shock troopers and commanders under Morgoth. They were his brute force on top of brute force, as it were, until the dragons came along. They preferred nothing more than basically to fuck shit up, and with violent intent and malice. Hence why I think they were natural spirits of fire. And, with the exception of Gothmog, Balrogs were never entrusted with any kind of high command or placed of location to watch over, unlike Sauron, who had been given command of both Thangorodrim and Minas Tirith during the First Age. So therefore it's easy to see how Sauron could play on those strings with the last Balrog of Middle-earth. But that's where we start to run into problems. See, Balrogs weren't geniuses, but they were extremely loyal to whomever they pledged their loyalty to. Not an easy task in and of itself because, in my opinion, to win over a Balrog, you had to intimidate them. You had to impress them to such a degree that you showed that you were leagues above them both in power and presence, and then demand their allegiance. Only Morgoth, or rather Melkor in this context, was able to pull this off, with the exception of one particular spirit of fire that rejected him. While Sauron is powerful, arguably the second most powerful Maiar in Arda, he's still just a Maiar, like Durin's Bane. Even with the One Ring, I don't believe Sauron could cow his fellow veteran Maiar because he was already evil to begin with. And, unlike Saruman, who, while evil, was still bound by the Valar, unable to use his full powers to his fullest when he arrived in Middle-earth, this is not the case with Durin's Bane, who arrived in Middle-earth on the run and fought actively against the Valar, never serving them. Sauron may well have had to fight the Balrog to prove it should follow him. And honestly, that would actually be interesting to see. What's more, Durin's Bane never swore fealty to him, but to Melkor. Now Melkor's gone. It's like when the general dies and all the sub-commanders are left to argue amongst themselves who should be in charge. Balrogs have no ambition greater than just destroying things after serving Morgoth. Like Smaug, Durin's Bane had no great desire to become the second Dark Lord, or even to run amok in Middle-earth as a whole during the Second and Third Ages. He neither showed an ability to command armies, nor wanted to for that matter. This wasn't because it had a change of heart, but because, I think anyway, it feared the wrath of the Valar coming down on its ass again. Had the Balrog emerged from Moria and attempted a repeat of its glory days, the Valar may have granted more power and agency to the Starry for dealing with it. Like I said in the previous video, there does seem to be more of a power scaling in terms of how much power the Starry can use or show based on who they're dealing with. And facing off against the Balrog, as we see in the movies and interviewed in the book, is no small skirmish. So this leaves Sauron with a similar choice that he had with Smaug. Better to leave Durin's Bane alone as a deterrent from allies allying against him than risk antagonizing him and spending more of himself and his being on an unnecessary conflict ultimately. And since it was the Doors of Khazad-dûm who had helped his enemies during the Second Age and almost derailed his war with the Noldor elves during that time until the intervention of Numenor, there's legit concern for this as well. So, in conclusion, an axis of evil of Middle-earth in the Third Age would never have worked, and it wasn't because of overwhelming power, but rather just the nature of evil itself. Evil is self-serving and self-delusional. By nature, it hates subservience to others even if it's forced, and only rarely is it convinced to do so of its own free will without resentment. And when confronted by a hostile and greater force, it cowers and runs, whether to wait for a more opportune moment or just to avoid accountability for their actions. Essentially, evil is all about ego, and, in my opinion, Sauron, Smaug, and Durin's Bane all had the biggest egos in Middle-earth. And why wouldn't they? They all, in one way, shape, or form, have a connection with Morgoth. All three were evil, but their evil worked itself in different ways for them individually. Sauron wanted to rule and shape the world in the best way he saw fit, no matter the cost, and to dominate all those underneath him. Smaug's was his intense desire to hoard the wealth of the dwarves and destroy everyone and everything that either got in the way of that or tried to take that away from him. And the evil of Durin's Bane was in that it had destroyed a kingdom so it could hide from accountability for all the more outright evil actions it had done in the past, and all the while maintaining its near timeless cruelty, malice, and brute force. So, with these clash of personalities essentially, none of these guys were going to get along. But, having said that, let me know your thoughts below on the matter. But this is the Miller Philosopher, and you guys have a good day.